All right, this will be the recording for Exam 2 for ELT 214, Sections 1 and 3. I'm going to do a review here for you guys just to make sure if you want to review for this exam that you have access to one. And Exam 2 is going to cover a bunch of good stuff. So I've sort of crammed the most pertinent slides, most of them having direct correspondence to a question that's in the exam. So there'll be plenty of questions on processors and memory, of course. Primarily, we're focusing right now on Intel Core i7s and Ryzen processors.
For gaming, AMD's better.
Okay. That's been the trend, hasn't it?
It has been the trend. Sorry, I was trying to find a flash drive so I can...
No, you're good. You're good. You're good. The I'm seeing that a lot. A lot of the gaming recommended builds are Ryzen these days. So, yeah. More power for the same dollar so you can spend more money on the graphics card.
Exactly.
So processors, when we pick one, we think about speed. We think about what motherboard's going to go with it, which is going to enable some other things. What architecture is it? Is it Intel or AMD, or is it something even weirder? Multiprocessing abilities, and can I take advantage of them? If I can't, maybe I should just get a quad core. If I have a job, an application, or a game that can take advantage of 8 or 12 processors, maybe I want them. We'll think a little bit about memory cache when we buy a processor, not too much about security. We'll think about features, virtualization. Any more powerful the processor, the better for virtualization. Any of you that are security majors should know that, because when you're working in virtualization, you're running an operating system within an operating system. It tends to take a lot of the computer's attention span. So the more powerful it is, the better, the faster you get your work done. Integrated graphics are terrible. Okay, here's your basic map of what a processor looks like. You should at least understand that while it all looks like a sea of unnamed electronics, there are sort of chunks and areas. There are buses and connections. There are, everything has its own little area, even though it kind of looks like a sea of transistors. You should know that when there's multiple cores, they each have their own individual memory, which is like having your own bedroom. But then they have to share a bathroom, like you're in a suite or a apartment suite in the dorms, or a duplex, quadplex, whatever. One of those shitty houses on Mill Street. And then the living room, place you all share. So the I/O unit is the unit that gives everybody else instructions, tells them what to do, sort of keeps the team together. Control unit executes those orders. We're going to do A, then we're going to do B, then we're going to position over here and do C. Actually, kind of like your field commander. And then the components that actually do the math, crunch the numbers, figure things out, find the solution. That's your arithmetic unit, your logic unit.
How does your Avengers work into that?
Oh, yeah. Does that all make sense to you? With Doctor Strange feeling sort of left out?
Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm. So the ALU is sort of the brain. It does the math. I mean, inside the processor is this thing that just does difficult mathematical operations at incredible speed all the time. So this is the thinking part of the processor. The memory supports it, giving it a place to store information temporarily. Of course, installing a processor is tricky. At this point, most everybody in the class has done this. If you haven't, next time you're in class, let's do it. It's not that bad. I'll guide you through every part of it. And you just drop the processor down into the socket, clamp it down, and put a cooler on top of it. So you want to understand how coolers work, what the thermal paste does. It's squished between the processor and the cooler. It transfers heat from the processor to the heatsink, which then uses fans or water cooling to move the heat elsewhere. And those instructions are for that cooler. Every cooler kind of clamps in a little bit differently. It's one of the best PowerPoint slides ever made. And let's talk about those heat sinks and cooling systems a little bit more. This is all centered around the idea that we're going to move air through the computer. We're going to pull it in on one side and exhaust it, push it out the other side. So how we do that? We have fans on the front of the CPU, we have fans in the back, and then heat sinks on the parts that get hot in the middle. The air passes over, and it's kind of cool. It's like room temperature, whatever your house is. Southern Illinois in August is usually about 99 with 99 humidity. This year we had it kind of easy. Climate change, we're all going to die. And yay! This is basically a graphical representation of cool air passing through the heatsink, warming up, and then get it out of the computer, and you're good. That's cooling. Air coolers usually use aluminum or copper, transfers heat, and then they just pull air through the heatsink to get rid of it. And they're quite effective. You almost never really need water cooling. It's neat. It's interesting. It looks good. But you don't actually need it in most cases. If you're really going to go crazy with overclocking or weird stuff, maybe you want it. Because it does cool slightly better, but not enough to really make a huge difference. Moving on to memory, we want to think about where memory gets installed on the motherboard, how it gets installed. I mean, memory, it's important to note that it doesn't actually remember anything. It only remembers things temporarily. It's literally like a goldfish or that guy from the movie Memento. It's no long-term memory. What's that?
Or me, yeah.
Or you have no long-term memory either. You're just a goldfish.
Of course not.
Okay, I understand. But basically, if you cut the power to memory, it forgets everything. It's just there for the processor to use as temporary storage. And if you have a gigantic video game and you're playing it, or a Photoshop file, you're like designing the next poster for a movie, it pulls the file into the RAM. The processor does its work with it there, because you can see the processor is right next door. It does the work in the memory, and then when you click save, shoots a copy of it back to the hard drive. But this is really where the work is done, between the processor and the memory. So the faster it is, the better. The more of it, to a point. You got to make sure you have plenty to keep the processor busy. Make sure it has enough room to store everything. So this is a normal size memory module. This one's RGB, which makes it extra desirable. In fact, just irresistible, practically.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a good looking, look at that. Like brushed metal.
It's hot.
Sexy. Yeah. I would swipe right on that. So then there's also little guys. And what are they for?
Laptops.
And
useless junk.
Useless junk. You mean all-in-ones? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All-in-ones meaning a computer where the entire thing is built into the monitor. So they use these to save space. Because they gotta.
It's not worth it.
When you're picking memory, it's easiest if you get two of the same kind. Like if you're like, I'm going to do 8 gigs, you want 2 4 gig chips of the same brand, same model, same everything. And that way they're going to match up. Otherwise, you kind of want to think about what speeds you're putting in. Because if you put in one really fast chip and one really slow chip, the motherboard's going to be like, all right, everybody is going as slow as this slow guy. So your really fast chip is not going to get much done. So this chapter, we also talked about power. So we got to talk about power supplies. You try to guess at how much power your system's going to need, and then you go a little beyond it in case the power supply degrades over time, or in case your power needs increase, or in case your projections don't factor in the CPU and the graphics card at full load. Like you're really working this machine. You're really, editing videos on it. You're playing a game that's really challenging it, and suddenly it goes over your power needs. You have either usually a crash or just a horrible performance. Just doesn't work. So running it at 100% also reduces its longevity. So if this is a 1,000-watt power supply, this would be best in a system that needs about 700. Yeah. Then for safeguards, if you're working somewhere sketchy, i.e. relatively anywhere in Southern Illinois, wineries, restaurants, local businesses, all seem to have really sketchy wiring. There's some really just not trustworthy electricians in our area. This thing helps a little. Put this on your computer, and it's like your computer is never actually connected to that sketchy power grid. It draws all its power from this thing's batteries, which always output at a nice, steady, safe rate. And then they pull power from the wall from that sketchy system that's having brownouts and power fluctuations and surges. And it just all gets leveled out by this thing. It is a backup power It's a surge protector. If lightning hits it, it will explode and your computer will not. And it's a stabilizer. These are great.
Would you say it's worth it for like a gaming build?
To be honest, I've had such an increase of power failures since COVID-19 in my neighborhood in Carbondale. Usually we'd have, one or two a year, incredibly stable power. Now we have one a month. If it gets any worse, I'm going to put my cable modem, my Wi-Fi router, and probably my girlfriend's computer, because she works from home. She runs a business out of here, all on a power stabilizing with backup so that when it cuts, she can still work for an hour or two, which is honestly all the time it's taken Ameren to fix it. So it's like a transformer blowing. It's something simple. They come out and switch boxes and they're like, well, totally worth it. We just blew up a $2,000 piece of equipment and we made $10,000 this month off this segment. So we're good.
Pretty much.
Yeah. If that gets any worse, I'm going to put stabilizers in. But currently, no. I would only do this on servers or other essential operations like that. So I always want you guys to generally remember your investigative method, reproduce the problem, list your suspects, eliminate suspects. We want to remember that the Windows 10 version of a crash is often the blue screen of death. It tries to record some information. Maybe it sends it to Microsoft. Maybe it's just bullshitting you. We don't really know. No one truly knows. You can scan this camera code with your phone to, download Candy Crush. I don't know what this does. No one ever does this. And you're pretty much on your own because this thing's never going to give you any valuable advice. And the equivalent of it on Linux is kernel panic. It's also kind of an unhelpful wall of text that doesn't teach you anything. But blue screens usually happen because of a hardware problem. Luckily, it's very often a temporary hardware problem. Like the software has asked the hardware to do something, and the hardware gets itself into a situation where it just is not going to do anything anymore. The software is now useless. The hardware must be restarted. If this happens every time you boot, then you have like a major heat issue. You have a major compatibility issue. If it just happens once and then the computer runs fine for a while, you're probably okay. Just be careful. Don't trust that computer. For overheating, you can use monitoring software. You can check the BIOS reports. If it's a newer computer, it'll tell you how hot it has gotten and when it overheated. If it's really dirty inside, removing dust will lower the heat. It just will. Dust is a great heat insulator. It holds the heat in there. It slows the fans down. It causes heat issues. So verify that your fans are nice and clean. Blow them out with spray air or wipe them down with a Q-tip and alcohol, because alcohol evaporates, doesn't leave any liquid residue. Shouldn't damage anything. Install additional fans. Good if you're having heat issues. We also had to talk this chapter a lot about storage. And mostly I would like you guys to be, for your careers, I would like you to be familiar with the history, the evolution of storage, how it started out with mechanical spinners, moved to solid states that still use the spinner SATA connection, like we see a SATA connection here, and it's still on this SSD. And then we were like, you know what? Why don't we just abandon this whole garbage apparatus? And then the M.2 has not only a faster drive, equivalent or better than this, but it abandons that SATA connection and goes with a new connection, which of course has a higher read and write speed. So your operating system boots faster on this guy. Your programs open faster. Your games load faster. Your files save faster. Everything's better. So this is what you want. It's important to kind of understand how the old drives work. They were, they've gone the way of the dodo now, but you should at least understand it. And so many things still use SATA. We're not done with SATA for a while. Any extra hard drives you put in a computer will still use it. Any optical drives you find in a computer will be SATA these days. It's on its way out, but not gone yet. And you should understand that a low-level format, when you buy a hard drive, when it comes off the factory and they've zeroed it, that means that a hard drive has millions of sectors that can either store a 1 or a 0, basically. And that's how the data is made up of. Ones and zeros, bits, bytes, builds into, your resume, a JPEG, an MP3. And when you tell the hard drive to zero everything go back to 0, that means everything is thoroughly gone and erased. High-level format doesn't do that. It just tells Windows, hey, pretend that drive's wiped and ignore all the old files, delete the old directory. And as you load and save new files, they will write over the old ones. But the old ones are still there until that happens if you do a high-level format. That's why it's dangerous. If you ever have protected information, you don't want to trust a high-level format. Logical block addressing, you don't have to worry too much about this. Smart, you don't have to really know that at all. Might be one question on there, but it's not too hard to Google it. Magnetic hard drives had spinning platters. They had this arm that reads it. It's very much like a record player. Pretty much every spinning drive you could ever see would be 5,400 RPM, 7,200, or 10,000. Can anybody guess what these different speeds were typically found in?
I'm guessing those speeds are used in like business or servers.
The 10,000 is definitely a server drive. Yeah, it's as fast as spinners go. It takes the most electricity, generates the most heat.
I
And
would say the 7,200 is for business and the 5,400 is for like consumer base.
yeah, most of the time when you find a spinner, it'll be 7,200. I would say that's 90% of them. And then at a laptop, if it's a if it's a laptop spinner, it'll be 5,400 because they use less power, gives you more battery life. They are slower. They are crappy. All of these are terrible.
Well, thank God we don't use those anymore.
I know. I can't wait until they're all gone. Can't wait until the last spinner is removed, put in a museum, and then stolen and thrown in the trash. So they work just like a record player. Of course, that analogy only works if the people you're speaking to understand how a record player works, which most of you don't, unless you happen to be a DJ, and then you kind of do. It's the weirdest thing. My generation, we all learned how record players work because they were from the 70s, the generation before us. Your generation, you're like, the fuck do I want that for? So yeah, both the hard drive and the analogy used to describe it are kind of going the way of the dodo. And hard drives could have bad sectors. You don't have to worry about this too much. Flash drives, removable, no moving parts, essentially solid state drive. They're usually pretty quick. If they're USB 3, they copy files to and from your computer very quickly. If your computer has USB 3. If you do FAT or exFAT format, they are read writable by Windows and Macs. They can go back and forth between the OSs. That's cool. And you can even put an OS on them. Most of you have done this lab where you put an OS on your flash drive and boot from it, either to install that OS or to actually use it live. Whereas with solid states, we got rid of the moving parts. They're faster. They're still more expensive, but they're getting pretty competitive here. The speed is definitely worth it. And they're getting to where they're more reliable. No moving parts means you can have a solid state in a laptop and drop it down a flight of stairs, and maybe you ruined the laptop, but your files are still there. Whereas back in the day, if you dropped a spinner, if it suffered hard enough physical trauma, you lost your data. It sucked. So, solid state drives versus M.2. Like I said, we sort of abandoned the old SATA port, went with this new thing that's faster and better. And that's kind of where we're at now. Even the like $600 or $700 Dells that John A. Logan and SIU are buying for general office use, lab use, it's a decent computer. Dude, you're getting a Dell. Don't bitch. It has an M.2 hard drive, so it's pretty quick. RAID is connecting a bunch of disks together so that they can act like one for backup purposes, for expandable, scalable storage purposes. You don't need to set this up yourself most of the time these days because of cloud. Cloud storage is just better. And cloud storage is undoubtedly using massive RAID arrays, but you don't have to. And
used in businesses, right?
Sometimes, like, you could get hired by a hospital and they'd be like, all right, we want you to be our server admin, and in this room we have our server hard drives and this is our RAID. And you'd be like, oh God, I'm in charge of this. Okay. And you'd want to learn everything you possibly could about it. Most places, though, you're going, like John A. Logan, it's going to be learn how OneDrive works. And Microsoft runs the servers. You don't have to think about the RAID particularly. You don't have to think about any individual hard drive dying. You just have to make sure that people are connected to and using their backup account, their OneDrive account. So it's getting to the point now where my technicians do not have to know that much about RAID, at least at SIU, and I think John A is in a similar state. Just because.
Would you prefer them to know more about cloud then?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, if I have two technicians that both work for me, and one of them is an expert on RAID and one of them is an expert on OneDrive, the OneDrive expert is going to be extremely valuable to me every day of the month, and the RAID expert is going to be valuable to me almost never in desktop support. Now, if you end up with a job as a sysadmin, like I said, where you get hired by a company or a hospital or school or police department or whatever, and they're like, you're the server admin. In the basement, we have a server room. It holds this data, this server, that server, and you're in charge of it. That's the job where you need to know this stuff. But desktop support, security, network engineers, 3/4 of the jobs that you're going to find in IT, you're moving away from this and you're moving more towards being a cloud and security expert.
Got it.
That's just kind of where things are headed. Optical media. Oh, these slides are going to go bye-bye next year. Just imagine those 2021 ELT 214 hardware students do not know how good they have it, but they are not going to have to learn. I'm going to take this stuff out. They are not going to have to learn that CDs had one layer on one side and DVD and Blu-ray had 2 layers of data on both sides. But sadly, you guys still have to know that. I really try to keep things up to date, but the certification exam is a gigantic thing with a zillion topics in it, and so it's always going to be a year or two out of date. There's no way they could ever update it every year fully. So when you go for your CompTIA, you're going to have some questions on it about optical drives. You're going to be like, oh, you're just never even going to see them, probably. Although medical industry is very behind the curve on technology because doctors are stubborn, I guess. I don't understand why. But you will still have a doctor tell a patient to go get an x-ray of their busted leg. They'll go down there. The x-ray technician will x-ray the leg and then put the images of your bones on a CD and send that to the doctor. Then the doctor will pop the CD into a computer and look at it. It's very late 90s, early 2000s level tech, but the medical industry, they're more interested in an MRI that can detect cancer earlier than they are a better, faster way to store files and move images around. They're just kind of focused on other shit. So as their technician, you will have your work cut out for you to modernize them, frankly. If you've ever been to the doctor's office and you sat there and looked as the nurse fumbled through like a Windows 7 or Windows XP computer and you're like, God, what year is it? Well, they're kind of out of date. They don't like to update. They also have ridiculously strict legal restrictions related to your patient records, your medical records. You have excessive coffee-based heart attacks. Well, that's a secret that they're not allowed to tell anyone, and they're not ever allowed to be incautious with that. So their network is extremely secured and air-gapped and separated from the actual internet. And so they're very reluctant to ever go, sure, let's go to Windows 10, and then they find out there's a new security hole. Like they move at a different pace, partly because of that. But this is one of my favorite diagrams to illustrate what the cloud is. It's really, a server is somebody else's computer. That's what server means. It's a computer that's nobody's sitting at and using, hopefully. It's just sitting there on a network handling print jobs or storing your files or giving people web pages or caching, Facebook videos or connecting viewers to a Facebook Live video or, it's doing all these different things. It has all these different purposes. And then the devices don't have to have that stuff on them, sort of outsourcing it. Like, I'm not going to store every video there is on how to take apart a silver iMac. The cloud's going to do that for me. It's going to be on YouTube, and then I can access it from any device I've got. That's basically it. Any of you who are present have any questions? I see Amanda. I see Josh.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. How you guys doing?
Doing great.
Horrible. I hate being stuck inside.
Yeah, you still in quarantine for a while?
Yeah, they had a mistake on my quarantine thing because initially I was only supposed to be quarantined